Um, so we are very delighted to have Ben and also John, and they are from the Christian Medical Fellowship. So I'll now pass the time to them.
Can you hear me? Is everything okay? Good, awesome, okay. My name is Ben. It's such a pleasure to be with you at the UCL Christian Union and Christian Medical Fellowship. I am a UCL alumnus. I graduated from UCL Medical School a few years ago. And during my time at UCL, I was heavily involved in both the Christian Union and the Christian Medical Fellowship. So it is a great pleasure to be back. I work in the A&E department in a hospital in North London, and I've been working there basically for the past kind of 6 months or so right the way throughout this pandemic. So basically, this talk is going to be in two parts. I'm going to firstly kick off by trying to tackle the topic of Christian freedom and joy in the here and now, as COVID is bringing suffering to our front doors and into our lives. And then after that, Professor Wyatt is going to be looking into the future and how we can have hope in the uncertainty of tomorrow. Now, I'd like to begin with a proposition. I'd like to begin by proposing that we live in an Epicurean society. What on earth am I talking about? Well, Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher who argued that the end goal of man, the ultimate purpose in life, is pleasure, comfort, and the absence of suffering. That's pleasure, comfort, and the absence of suffering. And I would argue that we live in the West in a thoroughly Epicurean society. I mean, how many times have you heard the most important thing in life is to do what makes you happy? And we will expend vast amounts of time and effort and money to gain comfort and to avoid suffering. And we get very cross when our comfort and pleasures are threatened. And the irony is, of course, that we live incredibly comfortable, luxurious lives compared with everyone else in the world and everyone else in history. But of course now, suffering has hit home. It has knocked on our front door and we cannot avoid it. As I said, I've been working in A&E during this pandemic, and probably the most upsetting and chilling moment I've had in the last few months was when I treated a very unwell nursing colleague who eventually went to ITU. That moment when colleague became patient really shook me, because it was the moment when I realized that this disease is not out there, but it's affecting my circles, my colleagues, the people I love. So what do we do when suffering hits home? Because suffering it has knocked on our front door and we cannot avoid it. What do we do when our lives of comfort and pleasure are threatened by sickness or bereavement or fear or redundancy or uncertainty or death? The Epicurean says, find what makes you happy, and if you lose that, find something else. However, I think the Bible gives a much better answer. Now, I'm guessing most people watching will be from Christian backgrounds. But I'm also guessing that there might be some of you who are watching who are looking into the Christian faith and perhaps wouldn't call yourselves Christians. If that's you, it's so wonderful to have you. Welcome. I think it's worthwhile for everyone, no matter what your worldview is, to give the Bible a hearing on the big and difficult questions in life. After all, the wisdom of the Bible built the foundations of the Western society we now live in. So if you have a Bible to hand, it would be really helpful if you could turn with me to Romans chapter 8, verses 18 to 30. If you don't have a Bible with you, don't worry, I will be reading the verses as we go. Romans chapter 8, verses 18 to 30. Now, Romans 8 is an immensely rich passage, and I only have time for 3 brief headlines. When suffering hits home, Paul, the author, encourages us to look to the future, look to the past, and look to the present. Firstly, look to the future. Here is Romans chapter 8, verses 18 and 19. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. And then verses 22 to 23 say this. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. Paul says that suffering should make us long for the day when suffering will end. The Bible promises that there will come a day when Christ will return, the new creation will be brought in, and he will wipe away every tear. I think one of the most universal feelings in the world at the moment is the craving for this pandemic to be over. I certainly feel that way. I can't wait for the day when we can allow visitors back into hospital and we don't have to see so many patients suffering and sometimes dying alone without family around. I can't wait for the day when we can have parties and concerts and we can travel the world without worrying about quarantine. And I have found these verses a rebuke to me because my craving for this pandemic to be over should be nothing in comparison to my craving for the coming of Christ and the end of all suffering. Do you eagerly await? Do you crave the coming of Christ? Firstly, we're to look to the future. And secondly, we are to look to the past. Here is chapter 8, verse 20. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it. Suffering is powerful evidence that the world is not the way it was meant to be. Genesis, the first book of the Bible, teaches that we were meant to live life in perfect joy and peace with God on earth. But because of sin, our rebellion against God and the curse that followed, the world was plunged into a state of sickness and suffering and evil and death. As we look around at the carnage that COVID is causing, it should remind us that we are living under the curse of God's judgment. And it should remind us of how big the problem of sin is. When you qualify as a doctor in the UK, you spend the first year on a provisional license. You're essentially on probation. And in that year, there are a couple of things that you are not allowed to do that other doctors can. For example, you're not allowed to prescribe chemotherapy drugs. Why? Well, because these drugs are really dangerous. The side effects can be awful, and if you use them incorrectly, they can be lethal. These are horrible, dirty drugs. So why do we use them? Well, it is, of course, because the thing that they are treating, cancer, is much worse. If these horrible, dangerous drugs are the treatment, oh my goodness, how bad must the problem be? And in a way, it is the same with sin. If the suffering the world is experiencing at the moment is part of the curse of God's judgment, oh my goodness, how bad must the problem of sin be? When suffering hits home, we should look to the past and remind ourselves that the suffering is a result of the curse of God's judgment, and the curse is a result of the seriousness of sin. Look to the future, look to the past. Third and finally, we are to look to the present. Paul reminds us that as we suffer in the here and now, we have a God who by his Spirit is in us, verse 23, helping us in our weakness, verse 26, interceding for us in prayer, verse 27, and working for our good, verse 28. And it is that last point I want to pause on. Here is chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. Epicurus essentially taught that suffering is always and totally awful, tragic, and meaningless. Paul teaches that although suffering is awful and tragic, it is not meaningless. But rather through suffering, God works for the good of his children. Now, can I name the good that's come from every single sick patient I've seen in A&E? No, I absolutely can't. I have no idea. But I do believe in a God who can work through seemingly meaningless suffering for good, as he does time and time again in the Bible. And actually, as this pandemic has rolled on, the more I have realized that God is at work, that there is good coming from this pandemic. The nation has rallied around the sick and the vulnerable, and especially the elderly and the frail in care homes in a way I've never seen before. I know many friends who have found precious time to rest and recalibrate and invest in their relationship with God. I, for one, have learned to value my family more. Speaking to so many worried relatives of patients over the phone who desperately want to visit their loved one in hospital has made me realize I need to value my family more and call my parents more often. And most excitingly, in my opinion, COVID has caused church attendance to go through the roof. There was a study commissioned by Tear Fund and reported in The Guardian that found that since the start of lockdown, 1 in 4 UK adults has tuned into an online religious service. And the vast majority of those will be churches. 1 in 4 UK adults. That is enormous. Do people still wear those WWJD bracelets? WWJD, what would Jesus do? I would like to start up my own line of bracelets with WIJD. What is Jesus doing? So when suffering hits home, Paul encourages us to look to the future and crave the coming of Christ. Look to the past and remind ourselves of the seriousness of sin and the curse that we live under. And look to the present, for God is at work in suffering for good. That is how we find freedom and peace and hope and even joy in the midst of suffering. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Ben. Shall I take it on from there? I want to carry on those same themes. So my name is John Wyatt. I worked as a professor and medical doctor, a specialist in neonatal intensive care at UCL for many years. I've now retired, but I'm still actively involved in research and in medical ethics and technology, especially now I'm working on AI and robotics and the ethics of the issues that are being raised. But today I'm carrying on this theme about coronavirus, and I'm conscious that, you know, we've all of us had a different experience, and it's possible there are some people on this call who've been really affected. You know, you've maybe seen people in your family who've been affected, even who've died. And many of us are worrying about what the implications of the pandemic are going to be for our education, for our future, and so on. So the pandemic has certainly affected people, has affected me through some of my friends. Very good friend of mine, Peter Hart, bass player. We played together in some bands and orchestras. He worked as a paramedic in South London. He got infected by the virus, was admitted to his own hospital, spent weeks in ITU being cared for by colleagues. He was a Christian, and there were fervent prayer from hundreds of people around the world. And then, sadly, he died in the ITU. And it hasn't been possible to have a proper funeral service or a celebration of his life. And I never had the chance to say goodbye. None of us did. And that same story, you know, could be repeated thousands of times. And I think people recognize this issue is going to go on. It's causing what psychologists call complicated grief. Apparently, 540 healthcare workers have died in the UK as a result of the virus. It's the highest number of any country apart from Russia at the moment. And that means there are traumatized health staff, there's PTSD, depression, burnout. And in the population, there's high levels of fear and anxiety. And it's almost like in the first few weeks of the lockdown, fear was government policy. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. That actually means stay at home or you will die, or you're going to kill someone you love. And so it's almost like fueling fear was what the government was trying to do. It was an essential means of reducing the death toll. And at least in the beginning, it seems that fear worked. It drove people to follow the lockdown. But the trouble is, once those fears have been aroused, once people have in their minds those images of mass graves or unconscious bodies in ITU or stretchers with body bags, once those images are there, they're not so easy to erase. And psychiatrists and counselors call this death anxiety. For some people, the effect of the coronavirus pandemic has actually been to bring out some of those deep fears about our mortality. The idea is that all of us carry deep fears about this unacceptable and terrifying truth that we're going to die at some time in the future. And so we go to extraordinary lengths to try and suppress this truth from our consciousness. We develop defense mechanisms. But the coronavirus has smashed through those defense mechanisms. For many people, we can't avoid the truth that just because we're human beings, we're fragile, we're vulnerable. As Ben said, at any moment in my own life, the life of someone we love could be snuffed out. And it's not surprising that this is leading to an epidemic of mental health issues. I was just reading a paper published in July in the medical journal The Lancet, and that showed evidence of the increased evidence of depression, anxiety, stress-related disorders, increased health phobias, binge watching television, increased alcohol consumption, increased call to helplines, increased domestic abuse, self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and so on. There's also been a marked rise in the time people are spending on aimlessly surfing the web. I wonder whether this applies to anyone on this call. Obsessively playing pointless computer games, spending hours sifting through social media posts, binge watching films and Netflix. Did you know what the literal meaning of the word amusement is? It literally means amuse, stop thinking. In other words, fill your mind with any old rubbish just so that you can stop thinking. Now, you might think that this epidemic of anxiety and depression and stress would be much less of a problem amongst those of us who are Christian believers. After all, Christians are people who are supposed to believe in a loving and all-powerful God. And yet, you know, all the evidence is that many of us who are Christians are also struggling with anxieties, fears, and depression. So the first thing I want to say is that fear and depression is a wake-up call that something is not right. So if this applies to you, it's a wake-up call. If I'm finding that my mind is constantly preoccupied with worries, with anxieties, with fear, worry about the future, if I find I'm struggling with black despair or addictions or suicidal thoughts, then this is a wake-up call. These are not healthy emotions. They're damaging and life-destroying. And living each day with my mind churning or my heart racing because I'm worried especially about the future, is not normal, it's not healthy, and it ought to be a wake-up call for each of us. And the interesting thing is that nearly all of our anxieties come from dwelling and obsessing about the future. It's all about the future. And Tim Keller, a well-known preacher, said this: worriers are visionaries minus the optimism. Worriers are visionaries minus the optimism. And I think that really makes the point. We think that by worrying and stressing about the future, we're going to somehow control it. The truth is that we're all control freaks. We want to control our dangerous and frightening world. We want to know that we're going to be safe and totally secure. and then we'll be able to relax. Actually, that's what Christian thinking calls idolatry. We've constructed an idol that we think is going to keep us safe. But the coronavirus has blown all those illusions of control to smithereens, and our idols have failed. We're constantly reminded that we're not in control, but even worse than that, nobody seems to be in control, not even the government. Not even the experts. No one knows when there's going to be a new spike in infections. No one can predict what's going to happen to our education, to our family, to our job prospects. Well, welcome to reality. We never were in control, long before the pandemic struck. But those deep fears and anxieties are telling us something about ourselves. They're a wake-up call that something is wrong. And perhaps these emotions are saying more about us than about the things outside us. They show us what is most valuable to us and what we're most afraid of losing. So that's the first thing. Anxiety is like a wake-up call. Second, how do we find some kind of meaning in our lives when things are going wrong? When everything seems to be falling apart, how do you get your head around what is going on? Is it possible to find some kind of meaning? And Ben's already talked about this. But Viktor Frankl was a young Jewish psychiatrist at the time of the Second World War. And he went through appalling suffering in the concentration camp in Auschwitz. And somehow he survived, although most of the people he knew died. And out of his experiences, he wrote a very well-known book, actually, which became a bestseller, and it was called Man's Search for Meaning. And Viktor Frankl's conclusion was that a person could survive almost any degree of suffering and trauma, provided they could perceive some meaning or purpose within it. For him, the way he survived was reflecting on the love of his wife and knowing that she loved him. And that gave him some kind of meaning in the midst of the horrors of Auschwitz. And he came up with this slogan: those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. And just speaking personally, I have to say that I too have been through a period when I faced enormous internal suffering. I had an acute psychiatric breakdown after I'd become a professor and was the academic head of our neonatal unit. And I ended up in a locked psychiatric ward, and I went through an intense period of depression and confusion and despair. And in the midst of all that, I said, how can I make sense of all this? And for a long time, it was very difficult to make any sense of it all. But actually, bit by bit, I started to understand and see how God was using this desperately painful experience in my own life to change me, giving me new ways of helping other people, new ways of understanding the love of God, new ways of understanding the heart of God and his purposes for this world. This happened years ago now, but as I look back on that really weird, painful, humiliating, confusing experience, I wouldn't actually have not gone through it. Even though it was so painful, I've actually learned things from it. It's changed me, and it's turned into a kind of strange gift. It was a gift I didn't want. It was a gift I never looked for. And yet actually, I've seen some kind of meaning, some kind of purpose in all that suffering. And so that's the question, and Ben's already talked about this, but it's interesting that in our modern technological society, we seem to have lost the sense, most people have lost the sense that there can be anything positive in pain, anything positive in struggle and in suffering. These things are seen as entirely negative and destructive and meaningless. And the whole purpose of technology and science is to avoid suffering and to maximize pleasure. Ben talked about Epicurus, the ancient Greek philosopher, but actually, Jeremy Bentham, who was the founder of UCL, invented the philosophy of utilitarianism. And the idea is it's the greatest good is happiness and the greatest evil is pain. And we all have to live in a way that maximizes happiness and minimizes pain. It's interesting, there's just one area in modern life where pain has an important value. I wonder if you can work out where that is. Well, I'll give you a clue. It's the gym. No pain, no gain. So it's interesting that in the gym, in the sports world, everybody knows that you have to go through hell before you can become an elite athlete, before you can build that ripped body, you know. But in the rest of life, it seems that suffering is just meaningless and totally negative and should be avoided. And if it happens to you, well, unlucky. But how does that philosophy match up to the realities of the pandemic? Does it provide a framework for me to resist? And so as I come to the end, you know, I just want to echo what Ben said, that the Christian faith gives a much more complex and nuanced understanding of suffering. Yeah, it says suffering is evil, but Christianity points to Jesus of Nazareth, who reveals a God of love, but also a God who enters into suffering, a God who takes it into his own life and his own being, a God who weeps and suffers with his creation. And from the perspective of the Christian faith, although suffering is an evil, yes, it's an evil, good things can come out of it. And to use the jargon, suffering can be redeemed. In some strange way, it can be turned into blessing and healing and personal growth. And that's my story as well. And so many people, myself included, would say that our lives have been strangely enriched by encounters with suffering, with pain. It's not that the suffering is just eradicated and wiped out. No, it isn't. But in the encounter with suffering, something strange and precious gradually emerges. And I'm convinced, like Ben, that there's nothing, however evil, however twisted, however malevolent, which cannot in some sense be transformed by God's grace and power and turned into blessing and healing. And I think that's true of this coronavirus period as well. Yes, there's real evil, real pain, real suffering, but it's not meaningless. It's part of a bigger narrative. And perhaps that explains why, as Ben said, so many people have been turning to churches and to other Christian activities. There's a hunger to find something more meaningful than Netflix and Facebook and Angry Birds. So to come back to the words of Viktor Frankl, those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how.
Okay, so thank you very much for John and Ben. So now we are going on to the Q&A section. So far I've received 2 questions. And if you have any questions now, you are still very welcome to either put it in Slido or in the chat in Zoom. So the first question is for John. So the question is, how can we reconcile when believing Christians don't recover from clinical depression?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, of course, even if you look in the scriptures, you can see examples of people, God's people, going through terrible struggles, emotional struggles. I remember reading, when I was studying psychiatry as a medical student, I was reading the Psalms and thinking, oh, there's the symptoms I recognize, you know, reading some of David's Psalms. So many of the people of God's people have suffered long bouts of depression. And actually, you know, it's interesting, if you look in Christian history, some of the best known names, very well-known names of Christian leaders who've had fantastic impact in their lives, they've struggled with lifelong depression, including people like Spurgeon, C.S. Lewis, Martin Lloyd-Jones. You know, in fact, if you're interested, there's a book called Genius and Grace, which is written by a Christian psychiatrist called Gaius Davis, and he goes through a whole series of biographies of Christians who struggle with mental health issues. So it's clear that being a Christian believer doesn't in any way guarantee that we're going to be protected from mental health issues, even just in the same way it doesn't guarantee we're not going to get cancer or diabetes or blindness or anything else. And also, you know, some people just have a single bout of very severe depression and recover from it. Some people have what seems much more like what Paul calls a thorn in the flesh. You know, you have some kind of intrinsic vulnerability, which means that you're always going to be struggling with this thing. And to be honest, I've got something like that in terms of my mental health issues. After my, I've still got some kind of residual vulnerability, and I've prayed that God would remove it from me, and I believe the same answer which Paul received. If you know your Bibles, you know that Paul prayed that the thorn in the flesh should be removed, and the message he got was that my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in weakness. I don't know if you heard that. My internet went to become unstable. Well, God said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in weakness. And that's something I've had to learn painfully, as many other Christians have too.
Okay. Thank you, John. So the second question is for Ben, which is like, does God punish people by allowing them to suffer and not saving them?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very difficult question. Does God punish people by allowing them to suffer? And I suppose my answer would have to be kind of yes and kind of no. So as we looked at, the curse that we live under, that is the cause of the world of suffering we live in, was an act of judgment on the sins of the world. And so in a sense, we are living under judgment. And that, I think kind of swings through all the way out throughout the Bible, that idea that we are currently living under judgment. But I don't think we can go so far as to label certain sufferings as judgments for specific sins, for particularly bad people. And that is very clear. So John chapter 9, Jesus walks past a man born blind, and his disciples ask, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answers, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Or you take Job, he suffers extraordinarily, and one of his friends asks him, surely you must have done something to annoy God. And when God finally reveals his plan, he essentially says, look, this stuff is far beyond your understanding. This is not simply a tit for tat, you sin, therefore you suffer. It's more complex than that. And why do particular people suffer in particular ways? It is often just very mysterious, and it's very difficult to understand. But I do trust that God, in his infinite understanding and infinite foresight, is working in all things for the good of those who love him. So yes, we're living under God's judgment, but it's not a kind of tit for tat, quid pro quo. I sin, therefore I suffer. It's more complex than that and more mysterious than that.
Okay, thank you very much.
I've just put the link or the information about the book into the chat that I mentioned. It's called Genius, Grief and Grace by Gaius Davis. It's a really good read. I recommend it. If I could just add a bit to what Ben said, C.S. Lewis was an incredibly influential and well-known Christian academic and speaker, wrote many, many books, including the Narnia series. And he wrote, when he was a don at university, he wrote this book called The Problem of Suffering. And it was a kind of sort of rather academic treatise, and he looked at the various arguments and so on. But then he had a sort of personal tragedy when his own wife, he got married later on in life and fell passionately in love with this divorced woman called Joy Davidman, and she then developed cancer, and he prayed desperately for her. She was in huge, terrible pain. She seemed to have some remission. He was convinced that God had healed her, and he was absolutely overjoyed. And then the cancer came back, and after some terrible suffering, she died, and he was absolutely devastated. And he wrote, and for some time it was like he lost his faith, or he was in danger of losing his faith. And the big thing for him was that it just seemed that God was punishing him and twisting the knife, especially because he thought she'd been healed, and then actually she hadn't. And to him it was like, we were just like a little animal and being in the hands of an adult. And the big question is God like someone, a vivisectionist, someone doing animal experiments on me? Or is he actually a veterinary surgeon? Is he doing something for my good? And Lewis really wrestled with this. Is God just torturing me for his own amusement? But eventually he won through to a sense that actually, although he couldn't understand it, he knew that God was there in this terrible loss. And he wrote this book, which I'll put it in the chat. It's called A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. Funny thing is, when he first wrote it, the publishers were so worried because he'd written all these other books which were bestsellers. They were so worried by this idea that C.S. Lewis might be losing his faith that they persuaded him to publish it as anonymous. So when it was first published, it was published just by anonymous. It didn't say who the author was. And it was only much later on that it was then republished under his own name. And apparently when C.S. Lewis himself died and people were going through all his personal effects, they found a whole series of copies of this book, which various of his friends had sent to him and said, you might find this really helpful. It talks about a guy who lost his wife. So C.S. Lewis must have been quite amused. He had a pretty irreverent sense of humor. I bet he was really amused by the fact that everyone kept sending him his own book, thinking it would help him. Anyway, that's a nice story.
Okay. Thank you, John. Because of time, I'm going to ask the last question. So maybe I would like maybe Ben to answer this question. The question is like, how can you explain this Christian hope in a really simple way to non-believers who have no Bible knowledge or understanding of Christian things?
Oh, that's I guess that the question is asking more for kind of how can you summarize the gospel simply, I think, rather than the process of how to actually communicate. Christianity Explored, which is a big evangelistic course that's gone around the world, originated at All Souls Church, which is the church that John and I go to, has a summary of the gospel that I think is very nice. It's a 3 points. It's the identity of Christ, the mission of Christ, and the call of Christ. From that, you can basically hang the whole gospel on the identity of Christ. Who is Jesus? He was the eternal God who created the universe, who breathed life into all of us, who then became a man, who walked the earth 2,000 years ago in history. The identity of Christ, the mission of Christ. Why did he come to earth? Well, the human race rebelled against God. We are sinful, and sin deserves judgment because God is a God of justice. But Jesus loved us enough to come to earth, to die on a cross, to pay the penalty for our sin by dying in our place. And then the call of Christ to repent, to accept the gift of forgiveness for sin for ourselves. And in doing so, we then gain eternity with God, and we gain a relationship with the God who saved us. So the identity of Christ, the mission of Christ, and the call of Christ. That's why that would be my kind of go-to as a sort of nice, simple summary of the gospel.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ben.